There we go. Okay. So I want to talk about a few things. One is obviously a little bit of our story, what it's like to practice, where we are, what our motivations were, and then specifically, instead of maybe some of the work that you might see on our website, I want to talk about a project called Our House, which is a bit of accidental innovation that has become bigger than we expected, and you know, the thoughts on that. So this first slide is really partly just to give us context, in that some of the major influencing factors for us are the weather. You know, we're having a terrible storm today. And we're literally placed on the very edge of the Atlantic Ocean. And I think, you know, the sea is about 2/3 of our planet, and it drives our weather. And there is a link along the Western Europe, the edge of Western Europe, which links Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, and Galicia down to the south, which remarkable consistency of concerns, generally driven by the environment that we find ourselves in, and that they're all rural, but they're all facing 2,000 miles of sea and weather. Skye was somewhere we kind of escaped to, probably a bit fed up with the architecture profession, and looking for a connection to the landscape, and also kind of at that time in our lives we had two very young children, and a sense of wanting them to be free range as they grew up, a kind of lifestyle decision. But in retrospect, I didn't think we really knew what free range teenagers actually meant. So that is a little warning for you all there. So the White Cross is where we kind of set up shop initially, built our own house with a little bit of help, but a remarkable place. This isn't edging into view there. This isn't the view from our office or our house, but is part of the big draw of the West Highlands and Skye in particular. An extraordinary place, and actually kind of an existential landscape. I think you know your place on the planet when you travel the landscape of Skye. It looks like the geology has just stopped shifting. It's just been formed. You're aware of the timelessness and the absence of people, and thereby your smallness, which is actually quite a refreshing state of mind, I think. The kind of perception of occupation of the landscape is the kind of postcard image of the white cottage at the bottom of a mountain. Now, again, that could be Scotland, it could be Wales, it could be the north of England, but that's the image in the mind. But it's a slightly false image in that it's rare, but the image persists and has driven the kind of view of how to build, certainly for the last 50 or 60 years. Planning policies have been driven by this, so they ask for every house to be 50 metres apart from one another, which creates odd diagonal arrangements in fields which are incongruous. And the buildings in themselves are bastardized versions of these small white houses, which detract from the landscape. and are something that we have kind of fought against in terms of finding a rural vernacular. Like I mentioned earlier, the power of the Atlantic Ocean, which kind of hits the land for the first time at the bottom of my hill. Sometimes it feels like, and kind of blasts against the landscape, and is truly terrifying at its worst, and it's something that has to be experienced to be understood. Really, some buildings, attractive buildings. By others, I would hesitate to say, have met their match in the in that. Now, that's an incredibly grounding experience, and we were quite fortunate to, very shortly after our landing on Skye, to experience still the worst weather event that has happened in the last 20 years. And that became a defining element in our work. If you realise that your building may not have a very long life if it's designed wrongly, and try and communicate this, I know it's kind of childlike in a sense, but the clothes you wear have a very similar relationship to the buildings that you would design. So, you don't take an umbrella up a mountain, and indeed you don't even take a wide-brimmed hat, but you might wear a little woolly bonnet. And it's no accident that the indigenous building types of the West Highlands effectively have that woolly bonnet. And for buildings that look very primitive, the science actually and the accumulated knowledge in these buildings, which had developed over a 200 or 300 year period, is extraordinary the more you find out about them. But I will save you my Black House lecture right now. The other kind of vernacular dwelling isn't the White House. And I love showing this to planning officers. This is my favourite slide. It's a building on Tyree, a building that has developed over time, and each generation has added its little bit. We call it crofter styles. Crofters are people who run small holdings up here and have a tenancy on the land rather than owning it. But families have stayed there for hundreds of years. And so these buildings have incredible stories. And I think once you understand the authenticity of it, they become quite beautiful in their own way. So instead of the slide I showed you earlier of the little white houses at diagonals, we like to explore the buildings that accidentally happen, the buildings that sit in between these white houses. The sheds, the barns. And I think it's interesting. All of us who split to the corners of the UK have all found great beauty in these buildings, and separately, which is fascinating. So, like Neil showed, these simple rudimentary structures carry great authenticity, great simplicity, and great efficiency of means, even up to the large sheds, agricultural sheds, which actually get built generally without having planning permission. And the thing called prior notification if it's an agricultural shed. So you get the light hitting it in the right way. They're also quite beautiful. Slightly different change of context, but there's a story which may or may not be true, but I like it nonetheless. And I think it sums up some of the attitude of the rural versus urban, perhaps. So there's a story of the space race, obviously, they're rushing to get to the moon. And somebody in NASA HQ figured out, oh, what are we going to do? Our pens won't write in zero gravity. So never mind, figuring out the Saturn rockets and so on. There was a mission to solve a pen that would write in zero gravity. And they solved it, they cracked that kind of puzzle. And you can still buy it today. You sometimes see it in the back of National Geographic. And then somebody thought, I wonder what the Russians did. They must have had a similar problem. So they sent off the secret spies and came back with this amazing answer. So what did they do? Well, the Russians used a pencil. And, I think that really does kind of sum up a notion that sometimes we shouldn't be looking for complex solutions to problems. And I think in the rural context, that really does encourage you to look at the simpler solutions. Construction technology here is remarkably simple. Stick-built timber constructions, so often built by one person. So this building was a one-man build. A very gifted tradesman, of which there are many up here. And occasionally getting help when you need to lift something a particular height or whatever, but low tech and simple. And, we embrace that idea. So this is a building called the Hen House, which is a name given by the locals because it looked like a hen house. But we quite like that. I think that means we've cracked the rural vernacular if our sheds look like sheds. And this was a building that unlocked quite a lot for us as a practice. Again, a fair amount of publicity and attracts other types of clients. And like Neil mentioned, these projects are great, houses with apparently unlimited budgets are fun. This is a community building, kind of using in many ways the same architectural language that we have been discussing. If you want to see more, there's much of these are on our website, but I don't really want to talk about these kind of projects. The slide is really just to trigger a kind of something about community, in that it's a very small community. So we know the builders, we know the planning officers, we know the building control officers, we know the clients if they're housing associations, and we'll often meet them in this place accidentally as we walk up and down. Our kids probably go to the same schools, and these people, like us, have generally been in the same jobs, doing the same thing for the last 20 years. I think that's quite an unusual situation where often architecture is quite an anonymous profession, where you might never meet the client, you'll never see the builder again, and so on. Whereas here, there's a responsibility because you will meet your client that you built a house for 20 years ago, perhaps every week, amongst all the others. And yes, there are occasions I might come here with a trolley and I might do a quick 180-degree turn because today is not the time to have that conversation. But being locked into a small island, the population in the sky is 10,000. It's not a large place. So our house was our kind of effort to build houses for everybody else and not necessarily get into the just designing houses for millionaires, which is occasionally great, but not necessarily fulfilling, I would say. So our house was an idea of trying to build efficiently, at relatively low cost, a house for everybody. This is a concept image we prepared about 11 years ago. And the idea was that this would be a modular in a design sense. So it started off as something we thought, well, let's let's be able to sell drawings for £1,000 to clients who want this. So we weren't thinking of building it at this stage, but we thought, well, we could design a kit of parts that we can clip together on the computer quite quickly. And we then had been working with a local builder, the same builder who built that house I had shown earlier. And we got on very well together. So we shared ideas, and that he was way ahead of the game and interested in prefabrication, mainly because he hated sending his guys out to work on days like today. It's both unprofitable and it's inhumane to put somebody out in a 60, 70 mile an hour storm. So he had an idea of putting a house in the back of a lorry and taking it to site and building it very quickly. And that's basically what we do. I don't want to get bogged down by the principles of prefabrication, but it's important it goes in the back of a lorry because we have to travel so far. Skye is 55 miles long from one end to the other, and we have to build things efficiently, logistically efficiently. So we don't look like a volumetric modular construction, because that would need 6 lorries to build a house rather than one. So we've stuck with panels, and they're very simple panels. They're quite rudimentary. They are the pencil solution rather than the anti-gravity pen. And the lorry now has a crane on its back, so it can assemble the houses. And like I say, they're very rudimentary. It's really just taking timber kit and adding additional layers on the outside, because we create a wind and weather type place. We don't add anything on the inside, because that would just take up floor space to do that in the factory. And ultimately, we have a dry environment. This is after one day that we can finish the house fairly traditionally inside. So that was an idea that that we had. In the first year, we built one house, the second year 2, the third year 4, fifth year 8, and if you know your logarithmic curves, now you realise that turns into quite a big company quite quickly. So our house now employs around about 70 people, and that's quite a number in a population of 10,000. The houses are very simple. We would like to think finely crafted. We spend a lot of time making sure these buildings are durable and are going to last. You know, again, many people draw timber cladding and just bash it on the outside of a building without really understanding how important it is to get the nail at the right depth, and the right type of timber, and the right detailing. It's very important to us, an absolute passion. And these houses can be assembled. So in all sorts of configurations. So in a sense, we've disrupted our own business, because we no longer do houses for in the kind of 300 to 200,000 pound price range, and instead our house builds hundreds houses a year in that range. But we get employed to manage that process from an architectural perspective, and it's actually a pretty substantial part of our business and the most profitable part of our business. And all of that is accidental, because we just followed our nose. We didn't really worry where it would end. We just knew that it was working and there was sense. And the customers basically design the houses themselves. They start with a core and they'll add a bit on. And hopefully you can see some familiarity with that building in Tyree that I had earlier as an image. So these slides are kind of getting a bit slower. And of course, we always want to put these up against our beautiful landscape, because that's a very good selling job when we do that. And these are all our houses. Clearly, the stone panels aren't prefabricated, but we've got these skilled people as well. And we've even kind of moved more into developer scenarios. So rather than being developers ourselves, we lend our brands to developers, and that takes compromise. For example, I hate concrete roof tiles, but sometimes perfect is the enemy of good. So, you know, we do compromise at times. And like I say, these houses are now been constructed up and down the Highlands. And I think what it's taken though is, you know, I don't actively manage this business. It's come from my partner James and myself, our heads, but it has now grown and it is its own entity. And you know, there are some things it does that weren't what we thought about at the beginning, but nonetheless we're very proud of it because it has done that thing, which is creating houses for everybody else. And I'd just like to kind of maybe wind up with a couple of thoughts. We came up with our house during the last recession, 2009. We'd gone down to a 4-day week with 1 day spare. So I used my 1 day spare to think of things. And that was our house. So we're back at that point again. And I think it is the point for creativity. And you can all see in the same way as 20 years ago, a 14.4 kilobyte internet connection was enough to start things. These days, we have this, and who would have imagined that? So my pet project for this lockdown has been thinking about self-build and trying to come up with a solution that doesn't necessarily rely on other people building for you. You know, the word shelter is an interesting word. It's a noun and a verb. A noun creates a shelter as an object, which eventually leads to it being a commodity. The word verb is something that you do. And I think that's very important. I think it's a human instinct to create a roof over your head. And so I'm thinking now of self-build, much like my grandfather might have done. Now, that's not my grandfather, but this is the image of my grandfather. And the practicality of that, again, the simplicity of an inherited knowledge about how to build, which is something that we've lost. The logistics of it, the stones only go so high because that's as high as you can lift a stone. You're not going to get it above shoulder height. And all of that knowledge is vital. So I think everybody should be thinking creatively and taking on whatever they fancy, really, because you don't know where it'll end up, but it'll sure to take you on a journey. Thanks very much.
Oh, Alan, you've ended. I've got so many questions to ask. I'm trying to work out where to start, but actually, in a funny kind of way, I want to start on the emotional side, which is when you left big practice, or, when you were a recovering parliamentarian. And you disappeared to the Isles. Were you doing it for kind of almost family emotional reasons over architecture?
Yes.
And could I ask?
It wasn't a career move. Let's put it that way.
Sure. So can I suggest that was it a romantic notion? Were you naive? Do you feel?
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. The reality is not what the dream was.
Yeah, because I think it's a really important point to get across actually to everybody who's listening today, because I was a woolly dreamer too. I kind of had preconceived notions about where I was heading and what I was heading into, and I think I can only say it from my own perspective. It really genuinely felt like almost a decade to actually fully understand where I was and what I was doing. When you're citing the certain dates with our house and also this kind of slow trajectory of practice, when you look back, can you see a defining point at which you suddenly went, oh yes, this is actually where the practice was really working in the way that I maybe had imagined it would?
maybe a couple of years ago, to be honest. You know, we built our own studio 2 years ago, and from then I think everything had felt a bit unreal. You know, occupying a flat in Portree or an old shop unit and staffing on multiple levels or in multiple locations. And we built our own studio, 2 years ago, and that's kind of unlocked what I feel like a collaborative, creative practice, and where we're trying to kind of create a business that if I get knocked down by a bus, it would carry on, and rather than it being a sole practitioner with helpers, if you follow. And that's quite an important thing for me. Always why I called it rural design rather than Alan Dickson architects. We wanted to create an idea of rural architecture. I kind of appropriated the name rural design accidentally. I think in retrospect that was a bit greedy of me, but it was 20 years ago when rural design as an idea barely existed. So
and Sam Mockbee was hardly known at Rural Studios.
Yeah,
so you didn't really have to worry about context, unlike myself.
No. Yeah.
But you did build Tin House though, didn't you, a few years
ago? Yes, I've built several self-builds myself, and I think that's got a massive amount of learning and knowledge, and I think that partly triggers my new passion for education in construction, let's say, rather than necessarily providing a service. But the service you provide is the education for people to do that. Massively inspired by Brian Mackay-Lyons. Yeah. He was probably the imaginary hero I wanted to be, because just a beautiful story of his work, beautiful work. And so I suppose I did have a trigger that maybe if I'm really, really lucky, I could be that guy, but kind of don't want to be that guy anymore, because he's a bit architecty, dare I say it.
I think you're totally entitled to say that, because it's funny, because I spoke to him only a month or so ago, and he was actually reflecting on what he'd built at the farm and the whole legacy of the Ghost Lab and this whole program in Nova Scotia. And I think he'd started undoing buildings that they'd built there because they were built so badly, or they were built by people in this kind of collaborative self-build model. Yeah. So he was left with a legacy that either was just incredibly expensive to manage, and I think there was a certain kind of reality check for him that he couldn't keep going, hence why it stopped actually in the end.
But I think that's good, because it shows a bit of naivety as well, which I think is a good thing and a healthy thing.
Yeah. I was just going to ask you about our house, because obviously this is a huge thing if there's 70 people involved.
Yeah.
And I think in practice as well, there was always this notion that actually you only can really do one thing well. Yeah. And there are plenty of precedents of architectural practices or engineers who've kind of tried to run parallel work streams, and our house is a good example of that. What's the tension between the two? So I'm going to ask Sarah after this, because of course they're starting out and
I really spend just one day a month on our house now. I like to think I've tried to create it as a kind of perpetual motion machine that will keep going without, and that's about employing people and trusting them to do things. And allow them to do things that you wouldn't do, like the concrete tiles in the developer housing. It's like, but it has to have its own, to succeed, it needs to have that energy. So yeah, you kind of need to almost step back a little sometimes to allow something to grow.
I suppose I'm steering it towards creativity, in the sense that you feel that our house is like a monster that will destroy your practice because of its actual benefit.
No, I think the two things can coexist. But so the practice concentrates a little bit more on master planning and on slightly larger projects, whether these are community projects, social housing projects, and yes, still the occasional kind of glamour project. And in terms of the architectural output, our house is about 30% of the workload because it's very efficient to do. Okay. And we promote the rural design side just quite traditionally. I know occasionally there's a crossover when a client may slide from one to another, but it's worked quite well. So no, but I think partly that's because I haven't really tried to run two businesses, and instead just allowed one to kind of fly off in its own.
Yeah. Sarah, could we maybe ask you that question then? Because I don't want to spoil your presentation, but of course you are running now parallel kind of offers in the practice. One is UBuild, which is obviously clearly a kind of entry level experience. The other is this paragraph 79, which is right at the other end of the market. How do you reconcile, or how do you kind of manage that within the practice?
So when UBuild was first conceived, it was very much part of Studio Bark, and something that was a lot of time was invested in developing that. And it was just kind of a case of juggling juggling that time. I think when you talked about our house being the most profitable part of your business, that's very much not UBuild for us. So we've decided to, as of about last year, we kind of made more of a distinction now between Studio Bark and UBuild, and made the decision to run UBuild as a not-for-profit, so that it can have a more, so it can be more community focused and the thing not be about profit. And one of the directors is going to take a couple of years to drive that forward and see where that goes. So there is more of a separation now, but we have used UBuild as an innovation kind of technique, or something that we can, a way that we can be innovative in paragraph 79 projects through testing this self-build CNC building system. So there is definitely crossover, and in the same way also we have clients that would kind of bridge from the UBuild self-build kind of system into having more architectural services. So yeah, some common themes with what you were talking about, Alan. But at the moment, yeah, it's quite a separate entity.
Okay, but it's interesting how it's become a very conscious kind of decoupling, the way you describe it, and even down to the business model, let alone who's running it. Which is quite important, I think, isn't it? Because otherwise, I think that's why I described it as a tension. There is a way in which some of these things can either suck or drain the energy or the money out of the practice, but at the same time feel like you're either not getting anywhere with it, or whether it's devaluing your stock. I don't know whether that was part of the conversation, or whether it's purely just a financial decision.
Yeah, I think that question of value, it wasn't having a financial value, but we still valued it in a way that we wanted to kind of keep progressing it and developing it. So so yeah, I think that it got to a point where it felt like potentially both UBuild and Studio Bark were being a bit held back by the relationship. So decoupling them was a way to be able to focus on what each of those different parts of the business needed to thrive.
Fergus, can I bring you in here? Because obviously you've been self-building. We'll talk about this a little bit more, and I don't want to sort of mess up your presentation either. Maybe we can go into it in a minute. But have you found, because obviously you've been building for years, really, haven't you? Even since you were quite young as a practice. Can you describe maybe the balance that you're finding there? Are you using it as predominantly marketing, or is it just a way of effectively learning on the job?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially we were desperate to get something built as a young practice. So we found that finding different ways to collaborate with clients was helpful. Or, for example, with our studio, we probably couldn't have afforded it if we had gone down the kind of main contractor route. But there's been a constant debate in the practice about that, and about whether we should do some kind of side developments. And actually, I've always been of the opinion not to, that we should do our own little kind of research projects. And if we're building a studio, then great. Or if we're going to build a second studio, which we're trying to look into at the moment, that's great, and they're our own projects, but that we don't kind of mix it up with a more commercial aspect, because I just know how hard it is, and I'm full of respect for you guys who can make it work, but I don't believe we could.
Well, maybe that's the difference of sort of looking like a swan, isn't it? Looking graceful on the outside, but actually paddling like hell underneath. There must have been some hairy moments, Alan, especially if you're saying this is a 2008 recession project, really. R doesn't stand for recession, does it?
It could do. I suppose it's, again, taking the brand, the R brand. So the company is called Rural House, so we have Rural House and Rural Design, I guess. But no, it was, because we took it really gently, it was really a hobby to begin with, and exploration, without any assumptions that it would become something. So yeah, it took a long time to understand what it was going to be, and then to get a company structure that meant that we didn't have to merge with a contractor, for example, so that we kept our own identity. So our house is effectively a licensing kind of model with exclusivity agreements between the two companies, but we work as one. And it's our house has been probably an easier ride than Rural Design.
Well, I suppose in some ways because you're in control of it, aren't you? Rather than actually all of these disparate clients with different, and different.
Yes,
styles.
and we're not reinventing wheels, which in the architectural side of the practice we have a tendency to do so, which can sometimes create problems for yourself, whether that's being too ambitious and clients' budgets then becoming an issue, or becoming too ambitious and contractor skills becoming an issue. All the problems that we face kind of day in, day out. So yeah, the Russians used the pencil analogy. It was very much kind of producing our house.